particularly as relevant to aging and bacterial responses to nanomaterials, which is an increasingly common environmental contaminant and concern. And so his most recent research has been focused a lot on adaptation to nanomaterials. Dr. Graves has also written extensively concerning biological concepts of race in humans and the history of race in academia and in the world. And he's written so many books, I'm gonna add them to the chat so you can have a look at some of those titles and order them now for reading later. Dr. Graves has also received numerous awards. He was inducted as fellow to AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 2012, he was one of NSF's Sensational 60, commemorating 60 years of graduate research fellowship award winners. His 1992 paper in physiological zoology and biochemistry was listed as one of the top cited papers over the entire course of that journal. I remember reading it a long time ago about selection on longevity in Drosophila and what are the concomitant effects of living longer. In 2017, he was named by the U.S. Black Engineer magazine and the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Council of Deans as one of the Innovators of the Year. Dr. Graves has been a leader in addressing the underrepresentation of minorities in science careers, having directed successful programs in that from coast to coast. If you've not read them, I'm also going to put in two papers on the subject into the chat window that I highly recommend reading. In my opinion, a sea change is needed in our field. Evolution has been and continues to be an inhospitable environment for Black and Indigenous Americans and Canadians. This sea change requires that we all listen and learn about the barriers and microaggressions that stifle their aspirations and careers. That sea change requires that we suppress the defensiveness and pay attention to the recommendations that we hear. And most importantly, that sea change requires that we then amplify those voices and enact recommended changes. So join me in listening and learning from Dr. Joseph Graves. Thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you, Dr. Sally. That was a really, I have to say, I'm taken aback by how nice that introduction was. So I hope everybody still loves me after I give this presentation. So I'm gonna share the screen, share my screen. Let's get this. Okay, and let's set this up so that we're actually in slideshow mode. All right, so this presentation is based upon a paper that was published in Evolution, Education, and Outreach in 2019 called African Americans in Evolutionary Science. And I'm also going to answer a number of questions that were submitted to the committee before today. And for those of you that submitted a question and might not hear it answered during my presentation, what I have been doing all morning is I've been writing detailed responses to each one of the questions in the Google Doc. And that will be available for anyone who wants to see them after this session is over. So to get a sense of what Dr. Sally was talking about, one of the things I like to do is to try to provide perspective by turning historical events into either a calendar year or a chronological day. So what you see on the screen now is taking the experience of persons of African descent in the United States or in America and turning them into a calendar, into a clock day. So we don't see, for example, the end of slavery until 2:43 in the afternoon. But shortly after that, at 3:33, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which claimed that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. Of course, these facilities were never equalized and still aren't equalized today in 2020. In 1890, we saw the second Morrill Land Grant, which created the historically Black land grant universities, such as the one that I'm currently employed by, North Carolina A&T State University. Now, you should be aware that the first Morrill Land Grant Act produced institutions that you are more familiar with, like North Carolina State University, and that was passed in 1860. The 1890 Morrill Land Grant was made necessary by the fact that throughout most of the former Confederate states and many of the northern states, persons of African descent could not attend these universities for PhD level training. So in 1946, the Society for the Study of Evolution was founded. This was, of course, a year after the end of World War II, and the world got to see in stark relief the logical implications of eugenic and racial policies in the form of what happened in both Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. But of course, what most people don't know is that scientists from Britain, the United States, and France created the theory which the Nazis put into practice under their regime. And that's actually discussed in my first book, The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium. In 1950, in the United States, the mass incarceration ratio, which meant the numbers of persons of African descent imprisoned relative to the numbers of persons of European descent, was 4-to-1. In the same year that Emmett Till was lynched, and which is sort of symbolized at the beginning of the American Civil Rights Movement, I was born. In 1960, the mass incarceration ratio had grown to 5-to-1. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and thus this was in fact the first time I had, at least in theory, equal rights as a human being in the United States, and that was at 8:29 p.m. A year later, the Voting Rights Act at 8:42 p.m. By 1970, the mass incarceration ratio had grown to 6-to-1 at 9:01 p.m. Okay, at 10:03 p.m., I earned my PhD in evolutionary biology. I am, in fact, not the first person of African descent to earn a PhD with an evolutionary biology theme. A gentleman by the name of Zoltan Dexo at the University of Texas actually earned his PhD in 1962. From what I understand, for most of his career, he was more of a fish biologist and actually really didn't do much in societies associated directly with evolution. But the same year that I earned my PhD, George Bush, secured the White House in part because of running a racist ad about a convicted felon, Willie Horton, on television. In 1989, the mass incarceration ratio had grown to 7.1 at 10:04 p.m. At 11:12, Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, something that I thought I would never see in my lifetime. But on that very night, I turned to my wife and I said, a lot of young Black men are going to lose their lives because of this election. At 11:34, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and Michael Brown were all killed by police. And of course, one of the things that has spurred this particular session was at 11:59 p.m., George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery were murdered. And at this time, the net worth of a socially defined white family in the United States is $171,000 versus the net worth of an African American or Black family at $17,500. Now, you can learn more about the mass killings of persons of African and Latino descent in New York City. So Eric Garner was only the tip of the iceberg in this documentary film entitled Profiled, which the link is present at the bottom of your screen. So 2012, I wrote an essay called Science in the Belly of the Beast, which addressed what I think are essential questions that one must ask themselves if they wish to commit themselves to anti-racism in the academy. So I asked young researchers to consider 3 questions. First, what are my goals? Second, how do they match the goals of the institutions I plan to work in, or in some cases now, the institutions you plan to establish yourselves? And what are the most appropriate strategies to achieve these goals? Now, these are not simple questions. So, how I answered those questions. So when I asked myself, what are my goals? As any scientist, I wanted to make important contributions to science. And I found that these often came in conflict with my agenda of advancing social justice. So early on in my career, I honestly felt that I wasn't doing much to achieve the second goal. So much so that when I got up in the morning, I had an extremely difficult time looking at myself in the mirror. So I developed a significant amount of self-hatred, which generated all sorts of self-defeating and destructive behaviors on my part. Things didn't get better until I recognized that I really wanted to make a difference advancing social justice. And it was on that day when I decided to devote the rest of my life to doing that I was able to look at myself in the mirror again without turning away. Now, I'm not sure that everybody's going to respond that way, but that's how I responded. Now, second question, how do they match the goals of the institutions I plan to work in? Well, historically white institutions, and these are institutions that were from their start established to benefit populations of European descent. Historically white institutions agree with the first, obviously. They want to make contributions to science. But they disagree with the last. And that's something that's extremely difficult recognition for people of goodwill who are in science careers to come to grips with. In other words, all universities have language, on their websites about diversity and inclusion. But one must actually examine what they really do with regard to diversity and inclusion and who their enterprises actually benefit and whose well-being is actually left out of the activity of the university. And I've argued consistently that historically white institutions, for the most part, benefit persons of European descent. Now, on the other end of the scale, historically black colleges and universities also agree with the first. They wish to make contributions to science, but I think that they are confused on how to achieve the second. And part of that has to do with accepting a role of a university in society that attempts to mirror historically white institutions, which I think is a fool's errand, but we can discuss that in detail another time. So then the question becomes, what are the most appropriate strategies to achieve these goals? First, I would say this to any grad student or postdoc, you have to establish your credentials in the existing enterprise of science. Okay, it is a mistake to think that you can change this system until people respect you as a contributor to the scientific enterprise. So you have to do that first. But then I argue that it's important to join the network of individuals that actually wish to achieve the latter. So this is, by the way, always been true. Okay, the scientific enterprise has always had people who are interested in maintaining social injustice, hierarchy, and in deploying science as a weapon to achieve these social ends. But it's also always had people who wanted to use their science and turn the enterprise of science to helping achieve the aim of social justice. And it might surprise many of the people listening to this conversation that I actually count Charles Darwin as being one of those latter individuals. He was raised in an abolitionist family. He actually did work that was crucial in dismantling many of the racist ideals of his time period. And he often gravitated towards social movements that were involved in creating greater equity and justice throughout the world. And that's something that's well brought out by his biographers. I have to turn to my bookshelf now. Adrian Desmond and James Moore in a book that they entitled Darwin's Sacred Cause. Now, when I talk about the enterprise of science, I distinguish that from the scientific method. Scientific method is the tools that we use to try to understand the universe and how nature works. And the scientific method has the capacity for objectivity. And we basically know these, means by which it can be objective. So things that we describe as peer review, responsible conduct of science, RCR, all of those things allow the scientific method to develop results that are objective. However, on the other hand, the enterprise of science describes how the tools and results of science are deployed within societies. Now, I also argue that in the United States, and I would argue this for also, Western Europe, East Asia as well, the enterprise of science hasn't been deployed to serve the interests of persons in power in those societies. So in the United States, that is mainly persons of European descent, and it is part and parcel of the maintenance of institutional racism in this country. So what I argue is what's required to help advance social justice is the development of anti-racism in science. Now, anti-racism is more than just saying, oh, I'm not a racist. Oh, I treat people fairly. All of my friends are not racist, and they all treat people fairly. Anti-racism recognizes that one must take affirmative steps towards breaking down the institutional ramparts that maintain racist activity and institutions within a society. So that is a much larger charge than simply saying, I myself am not a racist and don't think in racist ways. So I've always said there will never be science for the people until we have all the people in science. And that's not the situation that we currently have. So I see this as a set of obstacles and also opportunities. So I'm now going to start addressing some of the questions that were posed before this session. So one of the questions has to do with the demography of science careers. We're well aware of what's called the Leaky Pipeline, the obstacles in faculty hiring, promotion, and tenure. So to understand this, we have to look at the opportunity gaps within societies. I don't use the term achievement gap because this has more to do with who has the ability or the infrastructure to allow them to learn in the environments in which they live in. So I call for the defense of the public schools, which have been under an assault over the last portion of the 20th century. I call for the restoration of support and incentives to recruit and retain STEM teachers, particularly in racially subordinated communities. It's extremely difficult to get someone who graduates with a math degree to go into teaching in American high schools. They can easily make 2 to 3 times what they are offered in local school districts going into industry. And so when I was dean in the UNC system, I literally remember a year when the entire system produced 2 math teachers. Now, there were clearly more math majors than 2. But the simple fact of the matter is that anybody who's good in math and engineering is not going to first look towards a job teaching in the school districts when the salary for those people is so low. Now, we need to learn how to replicate successful models of undergraduate STEM mentorship. And these models exist, and they are well described in the scholarly literature of teaching and learning in science. So more of these successful models need to be replicated across the country, and I would also say internationally. Okay, Research One universities can create appointments that are focused on teaching and mentorship as opposed to the traditional research model. There's absolutely no reason, no rational reason to construct the faculties of these universities the way they are constructed. And I'm going to give you an example, personal example, without giving names. I was once asked to become the chair of the African American Studies Department at a prestigious Research One university, and this was in the last 10 years. Now, the way that university's academic appointments were set up is that the person who headed this department had to have an appointment in their discipline. So when the biology department was told that one of the finalists for the African American Studies chair would also be appointed in their department, they literally didn't know what to do, because the idea that somebody who has an investment in African American studies was also a biologist just didn't register with them, even though several of the faculty members in the department knew me personally. And so when I came to my interview at this institution, I met with the biology department and I asked them some simple questions. One of those questions was, do you know what the graduation rates are for your minority students? Nobody in the meeting could tell me. And then I began to ask them a series of questions about how they constructed freshman biology. And I told them that if I were to become chair of African American Studies at this institution, I would really want to see some major changes in the way freshman biology is constructed, particularly with regard to things that impacted the ability of minority students to successfully survive their first year at the institution. And not shortly after that, I was told I was no longer a finalist for that position at that university. Now, I know the person that they hired, and she and I both talked about what needed to happen at that institution. And so they hired her instead of me, but she quit within a year, citing the same problems that I had cited in my conversation with that institution. So this is sort of an object lesson of how intransigent views of how we teach undergraduate students and how we construct our academic departments get in the way of bringing about racial justice at premier universities. And none of this is required. So one of the things that I did when I was academic dean at North Carolina A&T, and I was charged with general education, is I hired people whose main focus was teaching and mentorship and the scholarship of teaching and learning. Now, I hired several of these people, and my academic division didn't lose a beat with regard to its scholarly achievements. In fact, in the 5 years that I was dean of that division with all of these folks who were focused on teaching, learning, and mentorship, we published just as much per faculty member as any other division within the university. And that was not just in teaching and learning journals, but also in disciplinary journals. So this can be done. I have experience doing this. And this could make a tremendous difference with regard to that so-called leaky pipeline that we all know about. So another thing that needs to be done is examining the criteria for graduate school admission, particularly the graduate record exam. So I think the scholarship on this is rather clear. The graduate record exam predicts rather accurately how well a student will do in their first year of graduate school. However, it does not predict the graduation rates of students. So what we learn about this test is that students who get really high GREs, usually do quite well in graduate school. Students who get very low GREs usually don't make it through their first year. But But in the middle, there's no way to distinguish people who do really well from people who don't do so well. So it's really not that great a tool. And similarly, we can examine, what are requirements for advancement to candidacy within departments. Some schools use the traditional subject-based exam. Some schools use criteria which are more in tune with what a PhD scientist would actually do in their career. And I think the latter tend to perform better in terms of all students, but particularly minority undergraduates and graduate students than the former. There's also now a great deal of scholarship that indicates that active learning actually helps URM students more than traditional learning methods. So these are all things that need to be examined with regard to how your institution is operating its admission and also advancement criteria in graduate school. So postdoctoral fellowships. Research One and other universities need to invest more in programs such as that of the UC Systems, and here I mean University of California, Systems President's Postdoctoral Fellowship. And to give a quick description of how this works, the fellowships are incentives to recruit racially subordinated groups and women. So if a department identifies a suitable candidate, those people are put in a competition, and if that department's candidate wins, they get a postdoctoral fellowship that comes out of the UC president's office. So it's not something that they themselves have to invest to bring about. In addition, faculty positions are then tied to these postdoctoral programs. So if a person comes through this postdoctoral experience well and does, really good work, then the department has the option of creating a faculty position, again, with money from the provost's office, that allows that person to stay there. So you can create a pipeline where you grow your own postdoctoral candidates into being your own faculty. So this is akin to other systems across the country which allow what's called target of opportunity hiring, which here treats the diversity of the faculty as an important criterion for when monies are released to create faculty positions. So at the end of the day, it comes down to a question of, do institutions actually treat anti-racism and the development of a diverse faculty as a concern that they're willing to put their money behind? So it's one thing to say, oh yeah, we believe in these things in the abstract. What really matters is when you're willing to use institutional resources to help bring these things about. And so finally, I also talk about the reform of promotion and tenure criteria. And specifically, there's a need to reward racially subordinated groups and women faculty for the mentorship that they do of all students, but of particularly racially subordinated and women students. So again, I'm going to give you another personal anecdote. I was the chair of promotion and tenure at Arizona State for a number of years. So typically, I would see files that would come in, and you would see a male of European descent, with a very strong research portfolio, and with, adequate teaching, but very little university and community service. I would see files from women and racially subordinated minority faculty that had solid research, but not as good as those of European American males, but excellent teaching evaluations and excellent university and community service, particularly with regard to the mentorship of students, undergraduate students and graduate students from racially subordinated and female students. Now, the rest of the committee wanted to promote the European American males and not promote the women and racially subordinated faculty. And so I argued forcibly that in fact this was an incorrect perspective, because the university's promotion and tenure criteria made it very clear that excellence was expected in all three areas, not just one. And so what was happening is the traditional model was that if you have this great research performance, your teaching is so-so, you have no service, you get promoted. But if you're a person that has a solid research performance, outstanding teaching, and outstanding service, then you don't get promoted. So while I was chair, that got flipped. So I was sending files back to people with the standard portfolio, and I would say, okay, no, you're not getting promoted. You need to improve in these other two areas per the university guidelines. And championing the promotion of the faculty members that had solid research, but also outstanding teaching and also outstanding university and community service. So this was flipping the criteria on their head. So it really does come down to what you value as an institution. So if you value the things that can transform the character of the professoriate, then you're going to look at these criteria differently than if you think the status quo is fine. So another question was posed, should we teach about the history of racism in eugenics? Now, literally at the time that I saw that question, I'd just gotten off the phone with a PBS reporter who wanted to run a story on this very subject. So my answer is yes. This subject is literally a goldmine of logical fallacies that can be utilized to teach students about the enterprise of science. It's also full of villains as well as heroes of evolutionary science who've addressed the significance and meaning of human biological diversity. So in that regard, at the end of the Google Doc, I have placed the syllabus of my course entitled Genes, Race, and Society. It's also taught as Race and Human Diversity in the Anthropology Department, to give people examples of how you can create subject matter courses on this area, but you can also integrate these materials into your teaching of genetics and evolution, as I did over the course of my entire career. These subjects are engaging to students, and I mean all students. People want to know these stories about who scientists were, what they thought, what they did. And the other point is that evolutionary biology comes out rather well with regard to the moral scale in terms of people who were villains and as opposed to people who were heroes. So you can tell both and should tell both sets of stories. Now, a really good example of what I'm describing is how and this also answers one of the questions on the chat in the Google Doc, how I ended up doing this kind of work. Now, I went into my career as a Drosophila evolutionary geneticist, was interested in life history evolution. I had not written anything about race or racial biology or sociology of race, and I had never intended to. However, when the Bell Curve was published in 1994, I received a call from a sociologist colleague of mine, Dr. Ben Bowser at UC, at California State Hayward. And he implored me to write a reply to the genetic and statistical claims of this book. So most of the first reviews had been all about charges of racism. So various scholars would look at it and say, oh, this is just racist. We don't believe this. Well, that's not an argument. Saying that something is racist is not proof that it's racist. So I actually took the time to read the book from cover to cover. And I found all sorts of fallacies, as I said before, in terms of the gold mine of scientific fallacies. So I wrote 2 papers, and actually these were the first papers that addressed both the genetic and statistical fallacies of this book. The first came out in Sage Race Relations Abstracts called Race and IQ Revisited, Figures Never Lie, but Often Liars Figure. And the second was in a special edition of the Journal of Negro Education, which is one of the premier education journals in the United States. So this book, again, had a massive response. It was on the cover of Time and Newsweek. Larry Sanders, then president of Rutgers University, suggested that Blacks might not have the genetic potential to succeed in higher education. And at that time, I was the only African-American scholar who had both the genetic and evolutionary credentials to authoritatively critique this work, which I did. And this then, of course, led to my greater thinking about how and why people were treated racially in our society. And so The Emperor's New Clothes was first published in 2001. And I've also included on the Google Doc a list of the 25 books that I think every person should read about race and racism in the United States. Now, this was a list that was originally designed for the Episcopal Church. So there are some references to topics in religion. But I also argue that if you intend to do any serious work with racially subordinated groups, particularly African Americans, American Indians, or Latinos, you need to understand their religious background. And if you don't, you are never going to be able to reach these populations effectively. So then The Race Myth was published 3 years later. Now, this stuff hasn't gone away. So, you know, if it had been just 2005, then maybe we wouldn't be here today. But 2018, David Reich's new book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, which, by the way, I think is an excellent book, except for his chapter on race, was published. He got an op-ed in the New York Times, and we responded with a piece that the Times would not publish called How Not to Talk About Race and Genetics. But we managed to get it published in BuzzFeed. The link is there. Most of the people on this letter were sociologists and historians of science. I wrote the genetic arguments in this piece, which I think are solid. And then I followed those up with an article in a book about this very subject. Now, one of the other things I wanted to point out is that there are some very good documentary films that you can use in your courses. Still the best is the film Race, Power of an Illusion, which is a three-part documentary from California Newsreel. There's a plan to update this, and hopefully we will have a newer version of this film sometime in the next couple of years. All right, so that's really all I wanted to talk about directly. So what I would like to do is to go to specific questions that individuals who are listening to this presentation have.
Yeah, absolutely. And other Sally and I have been grabbing them from the chat as they come, and we've been grouping them into some sort of thematic categories to sort of help guide this conversation. And one that came up initially and then has been further clarified is a question from Teresa Osborne, who asks essentially, how well do I have to establish my credentials as a scientist before I can have credibility in fighting for social justice in science? Does that mean, quote, waiting until tenure, or do you mean sort of a different standard for establishing what you think of as these credentials? And then Bruno de Medeiros asks basically as a follow-up, given the pattern you described for tenure package and evaluations, and again, that advice to first establish yourself, could you talk a little bit about how you might reconcile these ideas? And on a similar note, Kathleen Grogan asks, additionally, if you must wait until you establish yourself, how do you break the habit of being quiet once you have made that leap to being established? So I guess folks just want a little bit more information about how you establish those credentials. What do you mean by credentials? And then how do you reconcile your desire to do these things with maybe waiting to do them?
Okay, so the first part of the answer is the simple one. How do you establish your credentials? You have to accept that the existing criteria are the existing criteria. And so you need to make sure that you are doing the things that the university and your department require. So, and that means, you know, publishing in peer-reviewed journals. That means getting research grants. That means if you're teaching, getting solid teaching evaluations. You are going to be evaluated on these things. Now, the other side of that question is, why am I telling you to establish these credentials? Now, if the world were really fair, if the academy were really anti-racist, then, you know, there would be no pushback for doing anti-racist work. But the reality is the university isn't fair, and it's not anti-racist, and it will push back against you for attempting to do this work. So it's a question of having credentials to protect yourself from arbitrary removal from the university. Not because I think you have to be quiet when you're an assistant professor or a postdoc. I think you need to protect yourself when you're an assistant professor or a postdoc. And so this also comes to questions of networking and recognizing that, number one, you cannot do this work alone. And number two, that this is a marathon, not a sprint. I am 65 years old. I started doing this work when I was 18, and it's still here. So the old expression is, how do you eat an elephant? Well, you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And if you think you're going to solve your university's problems in your first 5 years, I think that's a naive viewpoint. But having a network, particularly a network of mentors, helps you be able to engage in doing this work, and at the same time protects you from assaults against you for doing this work. And let me give you a really good example. What I learned from senior URM scientists at UC Irvine. So when I arrived, I was an assistant professor, and I didn't know anything about being an assistant professor, honestly. But there were people there who took me under their wing, and they taught me, particularly Professor Eloy Rodriguez, who then, you know, ended up going to Cornell, and I think Eloy is retired now. But Eloy taught me how to construct these programs, and he gave me work to do to help advance these programs that would look positive on my evaluations and not put me in danger. And so what I do, and if you guys can look behind me, I'm going to move out of my screen so you can hear my voice. But that's my research group at the Beacon Congress in 2018. And what I do is I engage in what's called tiered mentorship, in which I, as the senior member of the group, mentor associate professors, assistant professors, postdocs, graduate students, and undergraduate students, but through a network at which I'm the pinnacle. And so when there are really difficult issues that need to be faced against the administration, I'm the one who does that. I don't let my associate professors or assistant professors do that. I do it because, you know, because of my protection as a full professor, there's little that they can do to me. And now, don't get me wrong, there are still things they can do, but there's less than they can do to the postdocs, grad students, assistant professors, and so on. And at virtually every university in the country, there are some people like me, senior folks who want to do good. And whenever you come to that institution, you need to find who those people are. And you need to get under their tutelage, okay? And they will help you learn. They will help you navigate the intricacies of your particular situation. You know, who's on your side, who's not. And allow you to be able to do the work that you want to do with regard to these issues, but minimize the threat to you as a junior person. So I don't think you need to wait, but you need to be strategic in how you do this.
Great. Thank you. And another sort of group of questions that we're getting in through the chat are a few requests for you to expand on some of the recommendations you've made, particularly to departments looking to be more welcoming to people of color and increase their racial diversity. For example, Mike Weiser asks, could you expound on what steps you'd like to see in introductory biology courses that everyone has to take to be better suited for a wider range of students, and not sort of push them out at that point. And then also a bit about how other structural things that are part of grad school, such as even taking comprehensive exams, might also act in ways to decrease diversity. So just again, if you have any more specific recommendations as people who teach undergrad biology, or might be mentoring students through comps or being on the other side of that table, would be great. And there's a number of questions about that.
Well, again, I'm gonna type stuff into the Google chat that's more detailed and specific. And first, I want to say hi to my good friend Mike, and hope he's doing well. But with regard to freshman biology, so we know about the leaky pipeline analogy, and a lot of things happen in that freshman year that determine the path of people's careers. So I mean, again, I use an anecdote. At Oberlin College, when I came in as a freshman, I was actually interested in astrophysics, not biology. And I took a course called Advanced Mechanics and Relativity. And it was a really hard course. So I don't get me wrong, this is a really hard course, at least for me. And I am not the only student who struggled in that class. Okay. So, but there are only 2 African Americans. And I knew other students who were struggling besides myself, but I passed, and my colleague Karimi passed. But we were the only 2 who got red marks on the top of our exam saying, you have no talent for physics. You should never take another physics class at this college. So I left physics. That experience was it for me. And I ended up in biology, which, by the way, is just as mathematical as physics is. But the biology had a more welcoming faculty. And Karimi actually stayed in physics and ended up, getting his PhD and being a professor of plasma physics at MIT. But the simple fact of the matter is what students experience in that first course at the university is crucial for their trajectory. So one of the things we did at UC Irvine under Eloy's direction is we put our best faculty in freshman biology. And I mean, in terms of people who actually knew and understood how to teach effectively. Those were the faculty that we put in freshman biology. And 2 of them happened to be URM. So there was me and there was Eloy. So, all of the freshmen at UC Irvine's first experience in biology was seeing an African-American and a Latino biologist. And when I first got there, the number of undergraduates, URM undergraduates who were involved in undergraduate research was only a handful. But my 4th year there, they dominated the undergraduate research competition and were winning all the awards. So it does make a difference who your students see and who they interact with. Okay, and you, for example, might know one of these freshmen that again, I think a really powerful story. But so my first lecture as a assistant professor, at the end, there are all these students waiting to meet me, crowding the front. You've all you professors here have had this experience. But there's this one gangly, tall kid at the back who was a Latino who waited and waited and waited until everybody left. And he came up to me and said, Dr. Graves, that was a really great lecture. Please tell me what I can do to be a scientist like you. Okay, so I told him, okay, come see me at my office. We'll talk about it. We'll see if we can get you involved in some research. And of course, you guys know the name of this person because his name was Luciano Matzkin, who is now a very established and productive evolutionary biologist. But that's what happens when people see that, when they start their career. And again, this can be done. This is not something that is beyond the scope or possibilities of most, research land-grant universities. So I don't know if I've answered that particular question effectively, but there'll be more in the Google Doc. So could we take another one that's different?
Excellent. And a couple of folks have asked about that Google Doc, so I figured I'd just address everyone and say right now it is pretty much sort of an not quite yet complete document of sort of distilled questions and answers to some of the pre-submitted questions, but we will make that publicly available as soon as that is ready, and it'll probably live somewhere on our SSC website where people can find it. So yeah, this document is just referring to something that we're using to store some of the questions, but thanks to everybody who's been asking about that, and definitely there's a lot of interest in seeing that when it is ready. So we'll make that available as soon as we can. All right, let me take a look at these questions here. Okay, let's see. Okay, one of our current question askers, and I haven't seen this come up yet, for example, in that document, but Xianfa would like to know if you could just talk a little bit more about how your research interest evolved from sort of evolutionary biology to go into nanobioengineering, and in fact, our SSC president also sort of had a similar question about your background, basically asking, we are each subject to different influences that nudged us towards the study of evolution and careers in this area, and she would be interested to learn more about your path to studying evolution. And this might also be a good time to address a few questions that I've seen about sort of the perception, at least, that African American students seem to be much more interested in, medical sciences as opposed to evolutionary biology, and how we might combat that perception, or sort of deal with it if that might be sort of a actual phenomenon. So just, I guess, both personally and departmentally or societally, sort of about interest in evolutionary biology.
All right. Thank you, Sally. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the second question first. So in the 2019 paper, we looked at the numbers, and African American students are no more interested in going to medical school than any other demographic. So that's just a false perception. So the question becomes, how do you get more African American and other RSG students interested in evolutionary science? And for me, there's a scholarly literature on how people choose their profession and their scholarly interests, and it's quite interesting literature, and I think it's worth a read. But at the end of the day, it comes down to what's relevant for them. And so what I've always done is I've tried to make the topics of evolutionary biology relevant to the social experiences of my students. And I've done this, at 3 Research One universities, and it works. So one of the things I'm doing now, particularly at a historically Black university, is I'm teaching a course called Evolutionary Medicine. And through Evolutionary Medicine, I show how the main, intellectual program of evolutionary biology has an important influence on how we understand the progression of disease and things like health disparity. And my students absolutely love this class. And I teach it at both UNC Greensboro, which is now a minority serving institution, and North Carolina A&T. And so students are interested and they start doing research. And a lot of people in that picture took that class. So again, you know, you can do this, but you're obviously not going to get everybody, because, you know, there's a real need for African Americans to be doctors too. African Americans are underrepresented in the medical profession. They're underrepresented in dentistry. They're underrepresented in pharmacy. So I consider any student that I advance to a professional school of any kind, or who work with me in my research group and then get a job, I consider that a victory. Okay, not everybody needs to go into evolutionary biology, first off, because one, there aren't that many jobs for evolutionary biologists. Okay, but some of them do. For example, my PhD student, Sade Boyd, who's going to postdoc in, you know, microbial evolution with Pamela Yeh at UCLA in August. So this works. You can interest people who aren't like you in evolutionary biology, but it requires, one, that you address things that they're interested in. So one more anecdote, and then I'll move on to this question of how I got interested in evolution. So one of the things I had a real problem with when I was a grad student, and I started out in ecology. I know I said it. I actually did start out in ecology and then switched to evolution, but that's one of those dirty little secrets that I don't like people to know. But one of the problems I had was with people who were in conservation biology, because what these individuals showed me is that they were more interested in the conservation of cute, large-bodied, cuddly animals than they were with people's lives, particularly the people of color in the countries who were being exploited by many of the activities to conserve these animals that they were interested in. And that really, really turned me off. Now, I'm not opposed to conservation, not at all. But I am opposed to people counterposing the preservation of these cute, cuddly animals with the lives of these poor people whose land is being taken away, and, you know, who are forced to poach animals to live because they have to feed their families. So having this kind of understanding of what the issues are, again, can help you interest people who aren't, you know, just like you into the field. Now, why did I get interested in evolution? Number one, I went to school more interested in astrophysics, because I like to answer big questions like, you know, what is the origin of the universe? Well, what's the next question after what is the origin of the universe? It's what is the origin of life? And you can't study that without studying evolution. So another little known fact, or maybe more known, Mike probably knows this story, is that Richard Lenski and I were both undergraduates together, and we took our first evolution course together. And one of the things that sort of cemented our relationship, which we've had over the course of our entire career, was that in that class, with some really bright people, because, you know, our class, I think, graduated at least 5 members of the National Academy of Sciences, was that Rich and I were the only two that really got the evolution thing. And we had, you know, early discussions, and Richard will tell you this himself. He actually credits me with being one of the first people to help him understand how you actually did an experiment in evolution. And so therefore, I'm actually going to take credit for the LTE, because I'm the one that talked to him about how you do experiments in evolution, and he used that idea to come up with the LTE. So while they call him the man who bottled evolution, you can call me the guy who whispered in the ear of the man who bottled evolution.
There's a question from Mike Weiser that's a little bit related, and so maybe we should go there first before the next question. And that is there a role for life science departments to address healthcare disparities and institutional racism in medicine through changes in the pre-med undergraduate curriculum? And given what you just said, I would say, is there a way to prepare conservation biologists to better deal with the structural racism that you talked about?
Sure. Well, again, one of the things we've been trying to do in the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health, the link of which I put in the Google Doc that no one can see yet, is to address how medical scientists are trained. So in 2016, I published a paper with a co-author who is an anthropologist, one a medical doctor, and so forth, in which we looked at, how we could use evolutionary biology as a tool to develop higher level critical thinking in medical students. And so, we're working towards this goal, and clearly we haven't gotten very far. But I definitely think that by infusing evolutionary thinking in the pre-med curriculum more effectively, we can help to deal with the way that these individuals then deal with their understanding of biological and social conceptions of race, and how this plays into their understanding of the social determinants that impact health disparity. In fact, that's one of the chapters I'm pushing for, or giving a plug for my new book. It's one of the chapters in the new book with Alan Goodman. So in terms of conservation biology, I agree with you, Sally. To understand conservation, you really have to understand the social dynamics and cultural dynamics of the countries in question. And if you don't understand those, you can't possibly help the organisms that you're trying to help. And so spending time becoming culturally competent is something I think every scientist should do.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm gonna, since it's already somehow 1:10 p.m. here, I'm going to make sure to ask you a few questions that have popped up in the last little bit of time that do not appear to yet be addressed sort of in the pre-questions. Got a great question from Suzanne Alonso, who asks, how can we counteract the negative backlash that can come from doing equity and DEI activities? This backlash that a lot of us are grappling with and experience as sort of part of our jobs. For example, someone got the job grant position award because of their race rather than achievement. So hearing things like that. And so just sort of suggestions for, how to counteract that sort of pushback and just the general pushback to doing this sort of work.
Yeah, well, people are always capable of saying things that aren't true. If the behavior of the President of the United States is not indication enough of the ability to repeat the big lie over and over again until people believe it. So that's always going to be an issue. So, what I always tried to push when I was an administrator was evidence-based decision making. And so when people made claims about, our curriculum, I gathered all the objective learning-based evidence to show that our curriculum was effectively teaching students, and therefore arguing with evidence against, claims that people make. And in a racialized society, people can always, use the person got their job because of their race argument. That's an argument they can always make. What you have to do is make sure that you counter them with evidence that demonstrates that that's not true. Again, personal anecdote, when I was admitted to the University of Michigan, and that was, I think, one of the time periods that people would consider like the golden age of evolution at Michigan. Hamilton was there. A lot of the people who like Dulce Sluter, Trevor Price, Marlene Zook, we were all in the same department. Everybody said, well, Joe Graves got admitted because of his race. Well, one of the faculty members, showed people who were saying that, well, actually, Joe Graves had the highest GRE score of anybody we admitted that year. And so he used objective evidence to go against the racial claim. So I think that's one of the things that you're always going to face, and you always need to be prepared to provide evidence against the claim. The other thing, of course, is how do you protect yourself from the backlash? And I discussed that earlier. You're not going to be able to do that alone. So it requires networking and the support of other people. And I have to say, the environment for networking is now much better than it's ever been. I mean, I honestly have never seen this many people in this society, interested in these issues. I mean, I wrote articles, 10 years ago And now people are tweeting about, how did you read this article that Joe Graves wrote 10 years ago? And I said, well, that's cool, but I really wish people had read it 10 years ago.
Yep, always wish there was time for those things to have been read. Yeah, a few years in the past, definitely. Okay, let's see. I have a pair of questions that seem to tie together nicely from Corey Murrow and Nancy Chen, who ask basically, how do we engage with senior and even not so senior faculty and mentors that claim they are not racist, but on the other hand are not particularly open to participating in workshops or other activities, such as this talk, to learn about racism and why DEI things are important. Sometimes it feels like we're just waiting for them to retire, but this is not an active approach to make departments inclusive. Do you have any effective strategies to approach these people? And then likewise, Nancy Chen asks pretty much similar thing. Do you have any suggestions on how to bring everyone to the table for social justice work, especially those who are in positions of power and might not be thinking about these things?
All right, well, I've always observed over the course of my career that there's sort of two poles of the academy. One pole that's interested in making the progressive changes that we've been discussing, and then another pole that's adamantly opposed to making those changes. And quite frankly, the one that wants to be progressive is smaller, and the one that's adamantly opposed is much, much larger. But the biggest group are the group in between who just want to go to work, they want to do their science, they want to train their students, and they want to go home and spend time with their family. They don't really want to get involved in institutional politics. So what one has to do is to win more of the hearts and minds of the people in the middle and making arguments about how diversity and inclusion are actually ways of improving the science that occurs in universities and in departments. And there is, again, scholarly evidence that supports that. And you have to spend some time making those arguments. But again, it comes down to strategically doing this and who's involved in making those arguments. So one really good book that I recommend reading is called, gosh, I gotta get the exact title, but How to Become the Anti-Racist Church. Now, this book is about how to become an anti-racist organization. So don't be shy or turned off by the title church, because it focuses on the specific context of the Christian church. You can apply the principles that the author Barnard gives in this book to any organization. You could change the name to university, department, community center, and the lessons would still be the same. But he points in this book on how to make organizational change, and I think it's definitely a good read for anybody who wants to make change in their institution. And I will also, again, give more detailed examples in the Google Doc.
Wonderful, thank you. And now there is, in fact, at least a temporary link to the Google Doc, as it is this mythical document in the chat here. And of course, I will let everyone know when the polished version exists out there in the world. Again, it'll probably live somewhere on our SSE website. So I don't want to keep you for too long, but there are a couple just other sets of related questions that it might be good to answer, because I don't think they've been addressed quite yet. And one is from Supriya, who is asking, just in general, thinking about the enterprise of science, what are some questions that we should ask ourselves before we embark on a research project to make sure that our research does not end up being one of those pieces of research that contributes to racist, sexist, ableist, etc. Ideas or policies? Or is there any way of knowing that before you begin research?
So my answer to that is simple: no. There's no way to determine that your research won't be used by people who want to do bad things with it. The reality is knowledge is power, and any additional knowledge that you give the world can be used for good or evil. So I don't tell people to not do research because it could be perverted to an evil purpose. So the question really becomes, when you do your research, how do you talk about the significance of that research? Such that, for example, and again, I'll use the David Reich example, his work on age and DNA is really powerful and important stuff to help us understand the evolution of the human species. But then he chose to put a chapter in his book that was completely divorced, by the way, from his findings about the meaning of race in the 20th century. So, he didn't have to do that. And I argued and have argued to him to his face that it was a mistake to do that. So you can't control how other people are going to use your work. And again, I use another anecdote. My book, The Emperor's New Clothes, was actually used by a reactionary judge in Texas to argue against affirmative action. And what he said was, Graves says there's no such thing as biological races. Therefore, racism can't exist. Therefore, no need for affirmative action. I couldn't have possibly anticipated that some judge was going to cite me in opposition, as evidence in opposition to affirmative action. So the question is not whether people can use your research for a bad purpose. The question is, how do you speak about your research? And whenever your research is used incorrectly, like for example, when Nicholas Wade wrote Troublesome Inheritance, 171 scientists, including myself, sent a letter to the New York Times saying, no, our work doesn't mean this. So you can't control what people do with your research, but you can control how you speak about your research.
Excellent. That is a great point. That, there's probably nothing we can do from the research itself to prevent that, but the way we frame it is going to be the key. Thank you. And so I'm going to wrap it up now with a few more related questions that are basically some folks asking here and in the pre-questions for some advice, essentially, about how, for a lot of us that are just getting started on our journey of activism and working on these issues, how do we make that a sustainable part of our lives? And simply, how do you prevent burnout? Trying to do it all, which Abdul Holloway just asked. And I did see that a pre-question was something along the lines of, how do you personally keep going? So how do we make this a sustainable thing? And where do you feel that, you derive your energy and motivation to keep going with this? And I think that'll be a good place to end.
All right. So I'm not going to tell anyone here. I would be lying if I told people that, what I did was easy. I suffered tremendously as a result of the things that I did, and because I can look back now, I can give you guys guidance how basically not to be me, because I really wouldn't want anyone to live the life that I lived. Okay, it cost me a great deal. So one of the things that you guys have an advantage of that I don't is, number one, there is a greater layer of mentorship available to you. And again, at virtually every major university, there are people who've been doing this work for decades. And you need to get to know those folks. You need to read their works, because a lot of people have published on how to do this effectively. You need to interact with them and learn from them about how to do this successfully and maintain your marriage and maintain your health and so forth. So it's possible. But the other thing, again, is remember that you're eating an elephant. If you think that you're going to change society in a positive way in a couple of years, you're going to burn out. You're definitely going to burn out. And the final thing I'm going to say is to remember that history is like the life of a soldier. Long periods of boredom, but brief moments of terror. And in those brief moments of terror, a lot of things happen. You may never be alive for one of those brief moments of terror. And you may just be eating the elephant bite by bite. But at some point, things happen, societies change, and new plateaus get reached. So the object is to survive and remember that this is a journey. Okay, it's a journey. It's not a destination.
All right. Well,